Good morning. My name is Joel Scata, and I'm an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council. I work for the NRDC's Water and Climate team, and our team primarily focuses on helping to advance federal and state policy reforms that can help make communities stronger and safer to the impacts of climate change. In particular, we advocate for the reform of the National Flood Insurance Program. For better or worse, the National Flood Insurance Program is incredibly linked to flood policy in the United States and how that operates at both the federal, state, and local levels. Some of our work for the NFIP reform includes advocating for more mitigation funding, including more funding for buyouts. We advocate for more funding for the flood insurance mapping program, as well as pushing for that mapping program to start including advisory layers of future conditions, so communities can not only know of their current flood risk, but be aware of their future flood risk when they're making development decisions. And lastly, we also advocate for providing more information to homeowners, home buyers, and renters about the flood risks that they face. We see that one of the best ways to help reduce vulnerability to flooding is ensuring that people are informed. And we think that advocating for a improvement of flood risk disclosure laws concerning real estate transactions is critical to helping get that information into homeowners, home buyers, and renters' hands. Across the United States, millions of families live in homes susceptible to flooding. 41 million people, by some estimates, are expected to experience a 1% annual chance flood over a 30-year mortgage, which is about 3 times what FEMA approximates. However, one really only needs to take a look at this image. This image is from NOAA, and it is the 2019 spring flood predictions. As you can see, 2/3 of the United States are at risk of flooding, and 25 states are at risk of moderate to major flooding, which goes through the end of May 2019. Unfortunately, flood risks are not improving. As sea levels continue to rise and extreme precipitation events become more common, the nation's flood vulnerability is likely to worsen. Rising sea level has already increased the number of total floods that have occurred every year, or a number of tidal floods that have occurred every year by 5 to 10-fold since the 1960s in several East Coast cities. And as you can see on the graph, 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise will have drastic impacts for East Coast populations. 3 feet of projected sea level rise could inundate the homes of 4.2 million Americans, and 6 feet of sea level rise could inundate homes of 13.1 million Americans. Unfortunately, long before these homes are permanently lost, they are likely to become repeatedly flooded. And unfortunately, that does not get much better if you live inland, as opposed to on the coasts. Riverine environments are experiencing increased flood risk as well. The National Climate Assessment asserts that the heaviest rainfalls are becoming heavier and more frequent. AECOM also had produced a study a few years ago about inland flooding and found that on average, riverine floodplains are expected to increase roughly by 45% due to climate impacts. So why am I throwing all these statistics at you? It is to underscore that millions of more Americans will be at risk of flooding by the end of the century, and that this means that not only do they need to be adequately prepared, but more importantly, they need to be adequately informed about their flood risks. And that is going to be paramount. Making sure that people are adequately informed about their flood risk and flood vulnerability is crucial for emergency management work. However, for homeowners, home buyers, and renters to even learn about current flood risks, let alone future flood risks, is problematic. The inadequacy of flood risk disclosure laws and lack of access to FEMA data on flooding is a problem. On this slide, you can see a map of existing disclosure laws related to flood risk. 31 states have inadequate or no existing disclosure laws in statute or regulation. That's 2/3 of the United States that lack adequate disclosure laws to help inform homeowners, home buyers, and renters of the risks that they face associated with flooding. And inadequate laws meaning that far too many Americans have little knowledge of whether one of the biggest financial investments of their lives has ever flooded in the past and is likely to flood again in the future. So this map is compiled from research that NRDC did on the states and the disclosure laws. We rank those from best, which is green, to none, which is red. None meaning that the state had neither a statutory or regulatory law requiring homeowners to disclose past flood damages and flood history to prospective buyers. And now I'll give you just some examples of, states that have none, states that are adequate, and states that are the best for those disclosure laws. So as you can see, Missouri, we gave a grade F. Missouri has no statutory or regulatory requirement for a seller to disclose the property's flood risks or past flood damages to a potential buyer. This is problematic. Missouri, as many of you know, is a high flood risk state. And the last year in 2018 and likely in 2019, the state will experience significant flooding. And in the course of our review of Missouri's real estate disclosure laws, we found that a seller is required to tell a home buyer whether or not the home had ever been a meth lab, but not whether the home had ever flooded. I think that making sure people know about flooding is important, not because meth labs don't have their own issues, but the chances of living in a home that's been a meth lab or living in a home that has flooded, I think the latter is more likely and needs to be given to home buyers to make sure that they are making informed decisions on how to protect their families. Florida is another example of a state that has no statutory or regulatory requirements for a seller to disclose a property's flood risks or past flood damages to a potential buyer. In contrast to Missouri, Florida is a coastal state and extremely vulnerable to hurricanes. In Florida's case, there are some common law aspects that might require seller to disclose flood histories to a buyer. However, those laws and cases are highly fact specific. And NRDC's view is that if you have a clear statute or regulation about what must be disclosed to a buyer from a seller, you can avoid a lot of the confusing and attorneys getting into, back and forth about what actually needs to be disclosed. Having crystal clear disclosure laws is just smart policy and ensures that the information about flooding is adequately given to the buyer or renter, and that they can make a decision about whether this is the best opportunity for them and their family. Ohio, another inland state, we gave a grade of C. So per Ohio's disclosure law, a seller must disclose whether, one, the seller knows of any water or moisture-related damage to the floors, walls, or ceilings as a result of flooding, their property is located in a designated floodplain, and whether the seller knows of any previous or current flooding problems affecting the property. So previous flood damages as well as location of floodplain are really two crucial facts that a buyer needs to know. But Ohio only received a C because it was missing a third aspect that we find crucial, which is whether or not flood insurance is required to be carried on the property, either because it's located in a 100-year floodplain or because the property itself was the recipient of federal disaster aid, which thus mandates that all future owners carry flood insurance on that property. So that brings us to Louisiana. Louisiana, we gave a grade of A. Louisiana has one of the best disclosure laws in the country. It requires whether any flooding or water intrusion or accumulation problems exist on the property, and the nature and frequency of those defects, whether the property is in a flood zone, and if yes, that classification and that latest source of data, whether the property has ever taken on water due to flooding, and also how often, whether there's flood insurance on the property, and importantly, given the fact that Louisiana is often the recipient of major disaster declarations and federal aid to help rebuild, whether the seller or previous owner was a recipient of federal disaster aid that would require any future owner to obtain and maintain flood insurance on the property. And if yes, the type of aid and amount received. That information would really give a home buyer or a renter clear information on what the risks they are facing when buying a property or renting a property in regards to flooding. And so we at NRDC think that the best aspects of a disclosure law are the following. Whether a home has ever flooded, and if so, how many times and at what cost. If the home is located within a designated floodplain, i.e. a 100-year or 500-year floodplain. And lastly, if flood insurance is required. We see these three aspects would give a really good picture to a prospective buyer or renter about flood risks and how they can make decisions about whether to move into that property, and if they do decide to move into that property, to buy insurance or to take steps to reduce that vulnerability through mitigation measures. However, disclosure laws, real estate disclosure laws, only tell part of the picture. They don't necessarily benefit those who are already living in a home that might be susceptible to flooding. If you're not looking to buy a home, you won't benefit from a good disclosure law. So where else could you get your information? FEMA has extensive information about flood risks, especially because of the structure of the NFIP and how it captures claims. So NRDC has also been advocating in tandem to better disclosure laws are improvements of FEMA's flood risk transparency, or data, or advocating for better transparency of FEMA's flood risk data. And we're kind of pushing for two aspects. One would be a homeowner right to know. Under a homeowner right to know provision, the current owner of a property could contact FEMA to ask whether the property is required to carry flood insurance, for example, whether it was located in a 100-year floodplain and there's an outstanding mortgage, or whether the property had ever received disaster assistance. And they could also ask for past damage claims and assessments on that property, which would help inform them, whether to buy insurance if they don't have it, or whether to think about taking mitigation measures that could help reduce their flood risk. The other side of that would be a public right to know. So if you're a renter, or if you're a community official looking to ensure that development is occurring properly and safely, often you have access only to a flood risk insurance map, or flood insurance rate map, I should say. However, a lot of those maps are either out of date or not easily accessible to the average person. And so NRDC has been advocating what we call our public right to know provision. And that would be for FEMA to create a user-friendly, internet-based database where someone could look up current and historical flood policy information, on current and historical claims information, repetitive and severe repetitive loss properties and the locations of those properties, and whether the majority of the properties in a participating community were built before or after the effective date of the first flood insurance rate map, which would at least give community members and those who make development decisions a better idea of which properties are most at risk, as well as advocating for information about community compliance status. NRDC recognizes that there could be some issues with privacy laws, so we have been advocating for all this information to be anonymized or only displayed maybe at the zip code or county level or town level, depending on how many properties are in one of those areas, to make sure that people's personal information isn't provided, but that someone who is interested could still get a good idea of the area that they are living in and how susceptible it is to flooding. So there's a lot of support for better disclosure and transparency, both from nonprofits, from emergency managers, and from insurance companies. And as you can see on this slide, this is a letter that was sent from former FEMA administrators, Brock Long, Craig Fugate, David Paulson, and James Lee Witt, advocating for more information about flooding. And on the very bottom of the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the highlighted portion. And in that, they specifically state, we support solutions that would reduce the risk borne by taxpayers and the government while creating more resilient communities. One of these simple, common sense solutions would require sellers to disclose flood risks to buyers. So just to recap, getting information into people's hands about their flood risk and flood vulnerability is one of the best ways to start making steps to ensure people are safer and better prepared to address their flood vulnerability. That has to come from a combination of providing more information from FEMA about flood histories and flood damages and insurance requirements in tandem with disclosure laws. The reason why these must all be one is because FEMA data only tells part of the picture. So if a property has never been insured from the under the flood insurance program, that information on its flood risk might not be available. But if there's a good disclosure law and that property had flooded in the past, the seller would have to disclose that to the buyer if they had actual knowledge of that event, and vice versa. And if there was not that much information about a property for a current homeowner, they could hopefully get that from FEMA. And so that's why we really advocate for just better transparency of flood data overall. Thank you for allowing me to present this information to you, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.